ahead in the back. That's exactly right. Good for you. He was a real historical person. And what we're going to get at today is the fact that no one would have invented the kinds of things that Christians are saying about Christ. Okay, but we'll stick with the cross. The fact is that our theology is rooted in history because God participated in human history, not only in the incarnation, but especially at that time. So our theology is not speculation. It was not created by committee, by popular vote. Okay, how many of you think we should say that Christ is God? Let's take a show of hands. It's ridiculous. Our theology comes from history. What we teach and believe about Christ is rooted in history. So my topic today is the mystery of the cross. Not the history of the cross, but the mystery of the cross. And as I was thinking about that, I said to myself, we can't talk about the mystery of the cross until we talk about the history of the cross. You see, I'm wearing this. A lot of you are wearing something similar. Nice, pretty little cross. It's so clean. It's shiny. It's attractive. Okay? It suits our sensibilities of the cross. But that's not the reality of the cross. We have to discuss the reality of the cross before we can begin to comprehend the mystery of the cross. Now, I promise not to dwell on this, but the fact is we must confront the horror of the cross, the brutality, the scandal, the monstrosity, the cruelty, the debasement, the nonsensical aspect of the cross, the absurdity of the cross. That is the truth of the cross. That is the truth of the cross. And unless we face that, we're not going to understand the mystery. Now, the early Christians didn't need anybody to explain that to them because they had all seen crucified people. No one sheltered them from that reality. But we live in an age when even though we may watch brutality on television or in the movies, we know it's not real. We know that maybe that exists in other parts of the world. Very few of us have watched someone be tortured to death. But that's the reality of the cross. And because we are so insulated from that in time and in our cultural circumstances, we must begin there. So I'm asking you to be willing to listen to this. As I said, I won't dwell on it, but if he lived it, we should at least be willing to hear it and not turn away. Crucifixion was considered the absolute worst form of punishment. It was designed to inflict the greatest amount of pain for the longest possible period of time with the least amount of effort, while simultaneously subjecting the condemned person to the maximum degree of humiliation and shame. Crucified criminals were considered the worst offenders of society, those who did not deserve to die with any mercy, without a shred of dignity. And it was, of course, as I said, the worst possible pain. And that's where we get our word excruciating from. It was such a terrible punishment that it was forbidden by Roman law to crucify a Roman citizen, for to do so was to sully the entire reputation and glory of Rome. So Cicero said this: to bind a Roman citizen is a crime, to flog him an abomination, to kill him, almost murder. So that's how high. Listen, most people in the Roman Empire were not citizens. Very few were citizens, maybe 10% at the most. So they had a kind of privilege not to be beaten or flogged, and certainly not to be crucified. It was unthinkable. And yet, of course, Christ was crucified because he was not a citizen. He was a Roman subject. Crucifixion began with the scourging. The crucified person's robe was removed, and they were scourged. And it's amazing to me how the Gospels don't even try to describe this, maybe because they knew people knew what it meant. Jesus was scourged. In so few words, that would be enough to cause anyone to gasp at the thought. Anybody being scourged. And yet the Gospels, they don't even try to describe it. They just, matter of fact, he was scourged. Well, what did this involve? It's not a simple whipping the way the Jews would punish someone with 39 lashes. We all know that Jews use 39 lashes. Why? Because if someone died, the maximum penalty for the Jews was 40 lashes. If you administered 41 and the person died, you were subject to murder. That's why they never got to 40. They would stop at 39. But that was just a lash. That was a simple, singular whip. A flogging was different. That was not whipping. The flagellum, the object with which, the instrument with which Romans did a flogging or flagellation was this. It was not a rope with a single end, but multiple ends, and at the end of each was a metal ball and an iron hook. So that when it hit the person's back, the little balls pummeled their muscles and made them soft, and the little hooks took a piece of flesh out. And the gospel writers just say, and Jesus was scourged. And anybody reading that knew what that meant. But we don't really understand what that meant. The Jews had a limit of 39 lashes, but the Romans had no limit. 39 lashes is Jewish law. Romans didn't follow Jewish law. The Romans did whatever they wanted. They brought the person to the point of death, but denied him the release of death. So they brought the person just to the point nearly of death. And as the flagellation, as the scourging continued, the back became ribbons of flesh. And because, of course, that's a flexible kind of thing, sometimes it wrapped around the person and struck them in the front. And some Roman writers talk about seeing the entrails of people exposed who had been scourged. If you go to Cyprus, St. Paul was also whipped and scourged. If you go to Cyprus, the island, to the city of Paphos, you see that pillar there, how they tied the person? You can see the pillar where St. Paul was whipped like this, in the same manner. Then the condemned person had his clothes given back to him, and he carried the crossbeam through the streets of the city to the place of execution, and hung around his neck was the titulus, the placard which stated his crime. And in the case of Christ, it said very simply, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. They only carried the crossbeam, not the whole cross, but that alone weighed about 100 pounds. And having endured a particularly harsh scourging, probably because people were expected to carry their cross, and yet Christ, even though he was young and healthy, could not carry his cross. He had an especially severe scourging, and he could not carry the crossbeam. And as, of course, it was put on his shoulders, the rough beam would have sunk into the lacerated skin and rubbed against his wounds. He couldn't make it, even 600 yards to the site of the execution. Instead, as we know, Simon of Cyrene was enlisted to carry the cross to the place of execution. Once having come to the place outside the walls of the city, his robe was removed, and ordinarily, crucified criminals were crucified naked to add to their humiliation, to add to the shame. Now the Jews, because of their laws and because of Jewish modesty, loincloths were left on in Judea. Christ would have been thrown backwards on the ground with his shoulders against the wood, and a shoulder would have felt for the depression in the wrist and driven a 6-inch long wrought iron spike into each wrist, deep into the wood. And then the left foot was placed on top of the right, and a nail driven through the arch of each. So it wasn't through the hand. The hands could not support the weight, but through the wrist. The weight of the body hanging from the nails in the wrist put pressure on the nerves, and shooting fiery pains went into the fingers and up the arms. The only way to relieve this pain was to place more weight on the feet which then brought intense pain from the nails which had pierced the nerves between the bones of the feet. As the arms grew fatigued, waves of cramps swept over the muscles. And unable to really stand upright and leaning slightly forward, because he was being suspended from the wrist primarily, the pectoral muscles become paralyzed. That's this part here. And the crucified person could breathe in but could not exhale. And carbon dioxide builds up. And you just try it sometime. Try to breathe in but not exhale. Okay? Just try that. And see how much you want to gasp for breath. So how do you get breath? You have to step on your feet. That's why, in order to kill the criminals who were still alive, the two thieves on either side of Christ, they broke their legs. Because they couldn't put any pressure on their feet. They couldn't take a good breath. And in a short amount of time, they expired from asphyxia. Okay? So he could only gasp for air by pushing himself upward on his feet, his back rubbing against the rough wood of the cross and sending these shooting pains into his feet and legs. Then a crushing pain began in the chest as the pericardium began to fill with serum and compress the heart, making it harder for the heart to beat. Do you know what the pericardium is? It's a sac around the heart. It filled with serum, the clear stuff. You know, we said plasma, the clear stuff. So that's why when he was pierced with the lance, it said outflowed blood and water. First out came the water, and then came the blood. And what they said water really wasn't water, it was this serum. Now, crucifixion was designed to be a public event. It was obviously done outside of the city, but it was always done by the main gate leading into the city where everyone could see the person. And it was a statement by the Roman Empire, don't mess with us. This is what will happen to you. The cross was not very high. It was, in fact, usually rather low, so that people, perhaps the enemies of the criminal, could come to them and beat on them while they were hanging on the cross. They could spit on them. They urinated on them. We know that at least the Lord was mocked while he stood on the cross. But this was again done to add to the humiliation and the pain. So the truth is that people didn't die easily from crucifixion, and they could hang for many days. Now, because of Jewish law, they could not hang for more than that one day. In the case of Christ, of course, he was only there for the afternoon. But of course, with our saints, many of whom were also crucified, like St. Andrew or St. Peter, we don't know how long they hung on a cross before they died, because the crucifixion was designed to last a long time. And as they hung there, animals began to eat the flesh of the crucified person. And after they died, the bodies were left on the crosses to rot. They were not allowed to be buried, again, except for in the case of Judea. So that's why we know that the Lord was buried. But ordinarily they were denied burial, and that was to add to the shamefulness and the horror of this. This is a glimpse into the reality of the cross, okay? And this is why St. Paul felt compelled to say, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because the cross was a great shame. And it was something that the church had to come to terms with. So how did the world react to the cross? Well, let's start with the Jews, this was their Messiah. Why didn't they accept Christ as the Messiah? For this reason. Cursed is anyone who hangs on the tree. And St. Paul said he became a curse for us. Yes, he did. He became a curse for us. So the Jews, even today, if you ask them why they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, they will tell you that. Because he died on the cross. And that is the very reason why the Jewish leaders wanted him crucified. Because if they just wanted him dead, they could have arranged to take him for a long ride in the country, push him off a cliff, which they also tried, put him in some cement shoes, make him disappear somehow. Okay? They didn't want that. They wanted him publicly disgraced and humiliated. And that's why they took him to the Romans to be executed. Okay? So To this day, that is the reason why Jews believe he could not be the Messiah, because he was cursed by God. And Muslims, some of them do not believe he was crucified. Did you know that? Which they regard Jesus as a prophet. Some of them don't, actually most of them don't believe he was crucified, because God would never allow that to happen to his prophet. As the Jews said, well, God would never have a crucified Messiah. That's ridiculous. And so that is the reason. What about the pagans? This is a very famous graffiti called the Alexamenos graffiti. They had graffiti in antiquity, but you had to scratch into a rock. You couldn't do a quick one, tag it and run away. You had to stay there and scratch for a long time. Again, it wasn't against the law, obviously. So I'm going to clean it up for you. This is a 2nd century Roman graffito called the Alexamenos graffito. And it says in Greek, Alexamenos worships God. Alexamenos sevete theon. And who's his God? An ass who was crucified. And here he is in the posture of prayer, raising his hand to Christ. Alexamenos is typically a slave's name. So he may have been a slave who lived in Rome around the year 100 or sometime in the early part of the 2nd century, and somebody who didn't like him mocked him for worshiping the crucified one. So this was, again, the crucifixion is not something that anyone would have invented. And this also goes with our other doctrines. There is no way that the Jews, because all of the first Christians were Jews, the Jewish followers of Jesus would have said, he's God, if they hadn't experienced him as God. There's no way that someone would have tried to make these claims, because it is illogical. The Christians were ridiculed for worshiping Christ, okay? Because what were the Roman gods like? Well, the Roman gods, they were the Greek gods, right? What were they like? Zeus is a philanderer, and also so is Apollo. Aphrodite is also a slut, okay? And she's vain and she's jealous, and they fight and they argue. There was nothing holy about the Greco-Roman gods. There was nothing appealing about them, but you had to worship them in order to have their favor. So the idea that one of them or any god would come to earth and die on a cross, that was just too impossible to believe. So the cross was a major obstacle to faith for both the Jews and the Romans, because the Romans said, if a god were to become a human being, not just appear on earth like Apollo did, like a tree, as a tree or a deer or something like that, not just in a sort of a form, but in reality, if that were to happen, he would be born a king, right? But that's not how Christ was born. He certainly wouldn't be born a poor Jewish rabbi and die on a cross. That's just too hard to believe. What about today? What kind of Jesus does the world want today? This is the latest Jesus from that Bible miniseries. I call him the Brad Pitt Jesus. He looks a little bit like Brad Pitt, okay? He's a pretty Jesus. He's a pretty Jesus, okay? He's a bland Jesus. He never does anything to... Did you see that miniseries, by the way? Oh, my God. How many mistakes? How many big mistakes in it? Many errors in it. Even when Judas is kissing him, Jesus goes like this and embraces him. The kiss of treachery. Now, this is the pretty Jesus. This is the Jesus the world wants, the one that doesn't offend anybody. They want the hippie Jesus. Yeah, man, God loves you. Peace and love. This is Jesus. This is the Jesus of the world. This is the Jesus that most Christians are thinking about, okay? But, sorry about that. But this is the Jesus that we're supposed to be following. Pick up your cross and follow me. Oh, do we need to have the lights on? I didn't even realize the lights are on. Do we need the lights on? Okay. Anyhow, All right. A little bit, I guess, we have to have. Anyhow, we're done. But the point is, I don't know how well you can see how battered he looks in this picture, which we never see. You know, remember when that movie came out, The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson movie? And people, you know, were talking about how violent it was. I really kind of steadied myself to see it. And then after people said, what did you think? I said, it wasn't that bad. Because it really didn't depict how bad it truly was. They couldn't. Okay? So my point is this. The world does not want the suffering Jesus. The world wants the pretty Jesus. But that's the reality. This is the reality of the cross. Now that we know the history, the reality, let's talk about the mystery of the cross. Mystery, the word mystery, mysterion, also means secret. Secret. Okay? Not in the sense that it is something kept private, because we're not secretive about our faith in the sense that we don't want to tell people about Christ, but it is a secret because it was something which is not known or recognized. The cross was a mystery because it was the means by which God saved the world in an entirely unexpected manner. That's what makes it a mystery. Okay? So, not recognized, not understood, doesn't conform with human mystery. It was part of the plan of God from the beginning. And it was foretold by the prophets. This is why, first of all, this part, Isaiah 53, is quoted a number of times in the New Testament, including at the end of the Gospel of John when he summarizes the Lord's ministry. He says, "Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" Who has believed our report? It's sometimes translated. Who could believe this? Who could possibly believe this? He's quoting Isaiah, who foretold the crucifixion. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. Okay? As one from whom men hide their faces, the way we don't want to see the reality of the crucifixion. Okay? And we esteemed him not. So when the church was looking back at the prophecies, and of course after the resurrection when the Lord explained these things, aha, the light bulb came on and they began to understand it. He has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. And this is still how the Jews esteem Christ. He is cursed by God. Can you see that? But he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, and upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes, his wounds, we are healed. And the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. The cross is a mystery because it is illogical. If anybody was to say, how do you conquer death? Well, you conquer death by dying. You trampled upon death by death. How can you find life? Well, through death. How do you find joy? Well, through sorrow. How do you find victory? By allowing yourself to be defeated. That's illogical. That's a mystery. That's why it surpasses human wisdom. That's God's wisdom. But it is not something which is easily understood by people. We can't be convinced of this. We cannot spend our time trying to argue with people about why Christianity is correct, because this is what St. Paul said. We preach Christ crucified. We preach a crucified Messiah. Christ is the word for Messiah in Greek, okay? We preach a crucified Messiah. It doesn't make sense. We cannot appeal to people logically and expect them to accept this. So when the Corinthians boasted of their wisdom, St. Paul reminded them that faith has nothing to do with human wisdom, and the gospel has nothing to do with human wisdom. So to the extent that we try to convince people of the truth of our doctrines with human reasoning, or Genesis, how really the dinosaurs walked at the same time as human beings, and all these, kind of convoluted analyses that people go through to try to support the rational concept, forget about it. Because the Christ and the cross are contrary to human wisdom. And so St. Paul, thinking about this, said, where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? What he means is like, have them explain this to us. Okay? These people who think they're so smart, ask them to explain this to us. God made foolish the wisdom of the world, because we would never have thought to create, if we were going to make a Messiah, we would have done like the Romans. They can have him be born a king, have him live in a lovely palace, have him have a wonderful life with no struggles, certainly not the cross, right? But in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. It pleased God through the foolishness of what we preach to save those who believe. So we can only come to Christ through faith. That's what he's trying to say, because it doesn't make sense. The cross does not make sense. For the Jews demand signs, that's miracles, and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. We preach a crucified Messiah, a stumbling block for the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. The word stumbling block is the word skandalon. It's literally the kind of rock in the path that causes you to trip. You know, you're walking along in the path and there's a rock in the way and you trip over it. That's the word skandalon. It's where we get our word scandal from. That's why we speak of the scandal of the cross. Okay? So that cross is something that Jews cannot get over. It trips them up. And the Gentiles just think it's ridiculous. Okay? But the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So the cross is a mystery because it does not make sense, and it requires faith. It cannot be understood logically or intellectually, and in many ways it can only be experienced. So that's what he means by requiring faith. It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. So Paul is acknowledging, by the way, where did that come from? Does anybody know? 1 Corinthians. Because they were boasting, and the Greeks, he wrote to the Corinthians because they were arguing amongst themselves. Can you imagine that? Really, Greeks arguing? I mean, this is just unbelievable. But they were. Way back then, and they haven't stopped. So they were arguing over which one of them had the superior wisdom, which group had the superior wisdom. And he said, this has nothing to do with wisdom, but foolishness, and it requires faith. The cross is a mystery because it indicates the extent of God's love for us. And I said indicates because it just points to. Even that does not exhaust God's love for us. But after we went through all of this, that I described the crucifixion for you, so you probably heard that before, but we have to be reminded of it so that we can understand the love of God. Because he loved us while we were still sinners. He loved us even though we had sinned. He loved us when we didn't deserve to be loved. So this is what we call extreme love. Extreme sacrifice, extreme forbearance, extreme humility. And this icon is called the icon of the extreme humility. Yes, Father.
Eugenia, what is the cross? How would you...
He's going into the tomb. He is dead and going into the tomb. Okay? So that's what it represents. That he humbled himself to the point of death, and he's going into the cross. That's why it's called the icon of the extreme humility. So nothing, now when you think about it, that you can see God's wisdom. Nothing less than the cross could so dramatically demonstrate that God neglected nothing for our salvation. He didn't say, well, I'll come to earth, but I have to have a nice life. I'll come to earth, but nobody can treat me badly. Oh, I'll come to earth, but I'm not going to die. I'll come to earth, but I don't want to suffer. Okay? He neglected nothing for our salvation, which really means, ball's in our court, we are without excuse. We are not above doing anything. We're not too good for anything. Nothing should be too humiliating for us, too demanding for us, too much to ask of us, because Christ was willing to do everything, okay, for us. The cross is a mystery because it is a paradox. From humiliation comes glorification. From death comes life. From defeat comes victory. And St. Paul understood the humility of the cross, and he expressed this. Christ is the ultimate example of obedience and humility. So even though he was in the form of God, and the word there means he was God, he did not count equality with God something to be grasped, and that meant clung to. So he existed, he pre-existed. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. He became a man. That's why he's a servant, because he became a man. Being God, he became a man. That's the incarnation. And being found in human form, he humbled himself. He agrees to become a human, and he agrees to die, and even a death on the cross. There's nothing lower. So if you could picture that, St. Paul is talking about Christ as the Son, eternal Son of God. Up here, he comes down, 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 down. The depths of the humiliation is what he's expressing there. Where does that come from? Very famous passage. Philippians 2. That's right, Philippians chapter 2. But the humiliation resulted in his glorification, right? Therefore, God has highly exalted him. So Paul understood this. And when he wrote to the Philippians, we're talking about the year maybe 60 or 62. Again, if people say to you that all of this idea about Jesus being God, that was all invented later. Constantine came up with that, right? At the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, 300 years after the time of Christ, Constantine decided he should be God, right? That's what the Jehovah's Witnesses say. That's what a lot of people say. Point to Philippians 2. When Paul wrote that before the year 65, before he died, that's first century Christianity. That's an affirmation of the divinity of Christ, the preexistence of Christ as the Son of God. Okay? So, because of this, God exalted him. And that's why St. John, in his gospel, speaks of the cross also as the glory. The cross is the glory of Christ. And so this is why on our icons very often you will see this title, King of Glory. It is on the cross that we recognize Christ as the King of Glory. And Christ is God. No one else was capable of this except God. No one would have the wisdom of this except for God. So this symbol of horror becomes a symbol of victory. Death becomes a symbol of life. This symbol of weakness and defeat and domination becomes a symbol of strength and victory, etc. That is really the mystery of the cross. So what do the fathers of the church have to say about the meaning of the cross? Well, of course, so many things. But first, of course, it is the ultimate example of humility, that Christ voluntarily placed himself on the cross. We speak of his voluntary passion, his voluntary death. He was not a victim of circumstances. He didn't happen to get arrested. He didn't fail in his ministry. He voluntarily allowed himself to be arrested. That comes through in countless ways in the scriptures. He knows what Judas is going to do. He knows what's going to happen, and yet he allows it to happen. Now, in the icon of the crucifixion, again, it's not so dark, so you can't see it very well. We do not depict that reality. There is a reality in the icon, but the icon, of course, as you know, it is a theological statement. Western icons and Western statues depict the graphic nature often of the crucifixion, not so much the modern ones, but some of the statues and, of course, the medieval paintings of the crucifixion show Christ in agony, and because the nails were put through the wrist, the hands are like claws, right? And he's looking up into heaven, and he's bloody, and he's in agony, he's suffering. Well, we don't deny the fact that he suffered, but we're looking past that to the mystery of the cross. It is a reality because there is blood. It's very little blood. You can see a little bit of blood where his wrists are, and you can see the blood coming out of his side. So that's telling us that he was really human. that he really suffered, that he really died. And yet, the fact that his hands are placed flat against the wood is a theological statement that he willingly placed himself on the cross. He did not try to come down from the cross. He did not try to save himself, as one of the thieves encouraged him to do. And even though we know that he was a bloody mess, how is he depicted on the iconography? His hair is perfectly combed. Look at St. John the Baptist or St. Andrew, their hair's like this, On the icon of the crucifixion, Christ is all nicely coiffed, and he looks like he's sleeping, but he's not. It shows that he was at peace with his decision, okay, and that he willingly placed himself on the cross. The fathers of the church tell us that the cross teaches us that we must acquire patience. What seemed to be defeat became the greatest victory, but it took time for that to reveal itself. And God is patient with us. We need to be patient with others, even those who seem beyond help. We're quick to judge others, but we're very forgiving of ourselves, and it ought to be the other way around. We should judge ourselves harshly and be forgiving, easily forgiving of others. St. John Chrysostom said about the cross, "Let us not then everywhere seek victory, nor everywhere shun defeat. There is an occasion when victory brings hurt, but defeat brings profit. God has given you the might to conquer, not by power, but by endurance alone." So we should think about that. Sometimes we're always striving to be right, to achieve something. But as Chrysostom reminds us, sometimes that victory, the goal that we think is the victory, is actually our road to our defeat. Whereas what we think is our defeat can be profitable to us. The cross teaches us, according to the Holy Fathers, that we must have faith. God is in control. God is in control. So when the Lord said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" on the cross, it took a lot of effort to say the 7 things he said, because as I said, he was not able to breathe well. That is not a statement of defeat. That is not a statement of agony that he thinks God has abandoned him. That was a quotation from a psalm, Psalm 22 or 21 in the Orthodox numbering, Psalm 21 or 22. And in that psalm, it is a prophetic psalm, and it ends in glory with the person being glorified. But he had to be willing to give up control, to place himself under the control of other people. He had to allow himself to be subject to these people who did these terrible things to him. We have difficulty with that. We don't want to give up control, and we want to be in control of our own lives. But sometimes we need to let God run the show, let God have control over things. So St. John Chrysostom also discusses this when he says that the Jews did everything to try to bring him to shame. And that was, of course, through the crucifixion and in every other manner. And yet all of the things that they attempted to do worked against them. Okay? And he said their object was to crucify him publicly, that they might injure his fame, but the contrary took place. And also with the tomb, with placing the seals to try to prevent them stealing the body. The seals are what proved the truth of the resurrection. Everything, Chrysostom said, was made more conspicuous. The mocking, the jeering, the revilings, all of this had the same effect. They who seemed to have conquered were most of all put to shame, defeated, and ruined. The cross teaches us also that we must practice love, and not just love of friends, of course, but love of enemies. And we know that the Lord told us that he gave us only one commandment, and that was to love one another as I have loved you. So we know what that means now with the cross, what it means for him to love us. And it's not just that the Lord was willing to die for us, but the manner in which he was willing to do that. And if he was willing to do that, we will probably never be asked to allow ourselves to be tortured to death for someone, and yet he was willing to do that. And yet we are so unwilling to do little things for other people, and even smaller things for God. Oh, I don't want to fast today. It's too much trouble. It's Friday, but I know I'm traveling. I'm traveling 2 hours away. It's a fasting exception. Okay? I don't have to fast. It doesn't matter that there's all kinds of places along the road where I can find something else to eat. No. That's too much to ask. Stand in church. Of course, that's not a problem, standing in church. Stand in church for 2 hours? Oh, that's too hard. Stand for Jesus. Will you stand for Jesus? No, it's too much. Too much to ask. Christ endured the passion, Chrysostom said, to teach us to love our enemies. Okay? He bore all of this with great patience. And Chrysostom said, nothing pleases God so much as loving our enemies and doing good to those who treat us poorly. When someone abuses you, do not harbor resentment against him, but against the devil who is tempting him to do this. This is a wonderful point. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember that. That when someone is doing something to you, something evil to you, don't blame them. Blame the devil who is manipulating them and causing them to do this. And that changes everything, because then you don't react in an angry manner. You pity them. Okay? And this is what Chrysostom said. The one who derides us and nurses the fire of his anger is not worthy of being insulted by us, but of being pitied, since Christ was moved even at the thought of Judas. The cross teaches us not to expect honors in this life. And of course, isn't that what we're all going for? We want the promotion. We want to be recognized by people. We want to be the employee of the month, get a raise, whatever it is. But that is the way of the world. That's not what Christ came for, to be honored. He said, I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. Chrysostom said this, arise, O man, on hearing these things. He's talking about the Gospels of the crucifixion. Seeing your Lord driven in fetters from place to place, have no esteem for the present life. It is not a strange thing, is it? If Christ has undergone such great suffering for your sake, whereas you frequently cannot even bear up under harsh words. He, on the one hand, was spat upon, whereas you adorn yourself with fine apparel and rings. And if you do not meet with words of approval from all people, you consider life not worth living. Yet he was insulted, endured jibes and mocking blows against his face, while you wish to receive honor at all times and cannot bear the dishonor received by Christ. The cross is our greatest example, and we must behave according to the cross. I think that St. Augustine made a beautiful observation that of the victory done through the cross, and also how we should think about the cross as we cross ourselves. I want to share what he said with you. First of all, he compared the life of Christ with the life of an emperor, and the tomb of St. Peter in Rome with the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian in Rome. Because not just the tomb, they would build temples to the emperors because they would proclaim the emperor as God. So listen to St. Augustine talking about the lasting impact of St. Peter's life versus the impact of the Emperor Hadrian. In Rome, there can be found the tomb of a fisherman and also the temple of an emperor. Peter is there in a tomb. Hadrian is there in a temple. A temple for Hadrian, a memorial chapel for Peter. Now, of course, it's St. Peter's, but then it was a little chapel. An emperor comes to Rome. Let us see where he hurries off to, where he wishes to kneel, in the emperor's temple or in the fisherman's memorial chapel. Laying aside his diadem, he beats his breast where the fisherman's body lies. It is on his merits that he reflects, on his crown he believes. Through him he is eager to reach God. By his prayers he feels and discovers that he is assisted. So there you are. The achievement of the one who was crucified and scorned on the cross. That is how he mowed down the nations, not with steel, but with a scorned piece of wood. So, dear brothers and sisters, the victory of the cross came through the death, through defeat. That is why St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine and all the fathers talked about how we must behave according to the cross. Not to defend ourselves, not to reciprocate, but to allow ourselves to suffer humiliation and defeat sometimes, and death sometimes, if that's what we're called for. We should not be quick to take offense. So hear what St. Augustine had, and I'm just about ready to wrap up. What St. Augustine had to say. Why do you sign yourself with the cross? If you don't act the cross, don't sign yourself with it. Recognize Christ crucified. Recognize his suffering. Recognize him praying for his enemies. Recognize him loving those at whose hands he endured all these things and longed to cure them. If when you sign yourself, you don't recognize that, repent. So every time we sign ourselves, it's nice if we're not doing it mindlessly, but thinking of what the Lord endured on the cross willingly for our sakes, and let that change our thinking about how we interact with other people. The cross teaches us not to be quick to take offense, and this will be my last patristic piece that I'd like to share with you. The Lord is worshipped because of what happened to him. Not in spite of it, but because of it. And this is the great mystery of the cross. So St. John Chrysostom, at the time that St. John Chrysostom was preaching in Antioch, then later in Constantinople, even in Antioch in the 390s, only about 40% of the population was Christian. Did you know that? We think that as soon as Christianity was legalized, everybody became a Christian, but that's not true. 40% of Antioch was Christian, 40% was pagan, and about maybe 45 Christian, 45 pagan, 10% Jewish. So there were a lot of pagans, and they ridiculed the Christians, and they mocked them. And they said, you're only talking about, and so that they would not say that we only talk about the miracles of Christ and the wisdom of Christ, we talk incessantly about the cross. And this is what Chrysostom said. Not one member, but the whole body was made an object of insolence. The head with the crown, the reed, the buffeting, the face being spit upon, the cheeks being smitten with the palms of the hands, the whole body by the wounds, being wrapped in the purple robe, the mockery of the worship, the hand by the reed, the offering of the vinegar. What could be more grievous than these things? What more insulting? And yet, we read these things when we meet together. Why do we constantly talk about these things? This was what Chrysostom was saying. That the heathen may not say that you display to people in the nations the things that are glorious and illustrious, and yet you hide these matters of reproach. So at the great eve of Pascha, that's when he was delivering this sermon, let us read these things. When the whole world is present, all of these things are proclaimed in a clear voice and made known to all. Christ is believed to be God. And besides all the rest, he is worshipped because of this, that he consented to stoop down so much for us and actually suffer these things to teach us virtue. These things let us read continually, for great is the gain and advantage from doing so. Well, I thought I would leave a few moments for any questions or comments that you may have on the mystery of the cross. It is really impossible to find the words to adequately, I think, express the mystery, such a great mystery of the cross. But I hope it gave us something to think about. And I'm sure you're tired from your previous sessions. I thank you for coming and sitting so quietly. Does anyone have any comments or observations to make? Father.